What if I told you that I know one of the critical ingredients for predicting the results of the next US election? In the weeks and months before the 2016 election in the US, my colleagues used this ingredient to help them successfully predict, with hard evidence, that Donald Trump would become president. Now today I'm going to share that ingredient with you. I'm going to take you to 4 stops around the world to show you why this ingredient matters, not just when it comes to predicting elections, but for everything from anticipating and preventing outbreaks of disease to anticipating when the next recession will come. Now, I study the global economy, and I've been studying changes in the global economy for the last 20 years. And not just because I like to study, which I do, but because my whole career has been focused on helping leaders make decisions that are going to improve people's lives in the face of the dramatic economic and technological changes that we face. So a couple of years ago, I started to get pretty frustrated. And the reason I was frustrated is because we were starting to get really important things wrong. We were starting to miss really important major global developments. We had failed to anticipate the global financial crisis. We had failed to anticipate the rise of populism, the 2016 Trump election, the Brexit vote. And at the same time as we were missing these really important developments, I was looking around me and seeing, all of us were, these major technological changes. And yet when I looked at the data I was studying, the official statistics that were supposed to reflect that reality, they were largely missing. These events and activities were largely missing from the data that we were using. And so I started this, for me, what was an exciting journey of trying to actually document the gap between the reality and the data that was supposed to approximate that reality, get close to that reality. And I started to talk to policymakers about what was missing from these statistics we had. I started to talk to business leaders, and even talk to my children. In fact, when I was preparing for this talk, I practiced before my kids, and my daughter said to me at the end, "I already know all of this, Mommy. You talk about it all of the time." So this is when I realized I couldn't just be somebody who consumes and used the existing data and statistics we had. I needed to also be part of creating and producing data and statistics that better reflected the realities around us and better warned us about what the future would bring. And so one of the things that I discovered is actually that there's a very that was sort of driving this gap between data and reality was really quite basic. We weren't actually asking many of the people at the center of these changes about their own experiences. So why, for example, when we were measuring tourism, did we only talk to hotel owners, but we didn't ask individuals who were renting out their places on Airbnb? Why, in advance of the financial crisis, did we not hear from enough people who were fearful about losing their jobs, who feared losing their jobs? Why didn't we not hear from enough of them before the crisis hit so we could have lessened the impact of that crisis? And this brings me to the critical ingredient that I did promise you, which is, if we want to reliably anticipate the future, we need to hear from those voices and perspectives that are traditionally that are under-reflected or often outright excluded from many of the economic measures and social measures that we use, that our leaders use to make decisions. So our first stop is actually going to be the UK. On the eve of the Brexit vote. So the polls told us that young people, so these are the example of some young people, the polls told us that young people would vote for the UK to remain in Europe. And enough young people would do that it would counteract the voices and the votes of older voters who would overwhelmingly vote to leave. We now know that that did not happen. Why? Why did the polls fail to capture this? It's because young people tend not to answer surveys. And so pollsters go out and they speak to the small group of people that's willing to talk to them. And they go back to this group over and over again. And that group tends to look like these people. These are the most engaged, the most likely to share their opinion, and therefore the most likely to vote. The problem was the pollsters didn't speak to enough people who didn't plan to vote. And then on the day of the Brexit vote, they failed to anticipate that not enough young people would actually show up to vote. So pollsters miscalled Brexit not because they didn't speak to young people at all, but because they spoke largely to the outliers, and they missed the majority. We've been told that the opinion and behavioral data, the data we see in the news every day on people's opinions and behaviors, reflect the views of all of us. The reality is that most of these data reflect the views of the most engaged, the most likely to share their opinion, and in many cases, people who have self-selected to fill out survey after survey all day long to earn money. What about social media, you might ask? So every day on social media, so on Twitter, for example, those of us on Twitter, including myself, we collectively generate 500 million data points. Now this is big data. This is huge amounts of data, and it's so exciting if you're a data scientist or data analyst. Really, really exciting stuff. But we have to be careful not to be seduced by the number of data points. Social media excludes vastly more voices than it includes. And we don't need to hear more, we don't need more data points on the same tiny group of people. What we need is to hear from the widest possible array of voices we can. So what we're doing actually at the company that I work for, Rewe, is that we're using a technology that has a very, very simple idea at its core, reaching out to a far, far broader set of perspectives and voices, and doing so systematically. The way we do this is by identifying web domains that represent the full diversity of the online population. So you have to imagine hundreds and thousands of these web domains that we've identified using algorithms. And we've selected them such that anybody online has a chance, an equal chance, of landing upon one of them. And if they do, we ask if they'd like to answer questions. We don't ask anybody for their names or contact information, because we don't want to exclude anybody who wouldn't otherwise feel comfortable answering, and that's particularly important in some of the countries that we look at where people don't have the freedom to express their views. The result of this technology, the result of this approach, is that the vast majority of people we hear from have not answered a survey recently or ever. These are the voices that the typical data collection exclude. We've now heard from over 1.5 billion real people, not bots, and in over 200 countries around the world. And when we applied our technology before the Brexit vote to speak to young people under the age of 40, so not just the engaged group, but those that are politically disengaged as well, they told us, yes, they supported remaining in the European Union, but half of them did not plan to vote. And had we heard those voices, we would not have been shocked by the Brexit result. Our next stop is China. Another light topic, the China-US trade war. So the story that we've seen in the media and the story that surveys and social media data in China have told us is that Chinese consumers are boycotting or using less US products in the wake of the trade war, during the trade war. Especially during that first year, there's a lot of hype and back and forth between the leaders of the two countries. And that people would stop buying iPhones, for example. And we saw that stock analysts actually dropped their price targets for Apple because they thought there would be a big backlash. They said there would be a big backlash against US companies in China. We actually reached out to the broadest set of possible perspectives online in China, across every region of the country. And we asked people, okay, so what phone do you plan to buy next? Where do you plan to have where do you go for coffee? Is it Starbucks or a Chinese company? Where do you plan to travel next? And we heard from 2,000 people, different people, each week and every week of the entire length of the first year of the trade war. 60% of them had never answered a survey before, and they told us that the truth looked like this, more like this. The stock calls were wrong. Chinese consumers had not changed their behavior. And we're talking here about a country where government officials, regularly manipulate the data, the economic data that we see, where social media is censored and monitored, and not to mention reflects a tiny fraction and sliver of opinion, and where survey data reflects, again, a very tiny fraction of opinion, where people's perspectives aren't even, but their privacy and their personal identity isn't even protected. So we need to think about if, when the next flare-up happens between China and the US, we need to remember that China is now central to any industry. So whether it's, cars to the NBA. And when that next flare-up happens, if we don't hear from this broadest possible set of voices in China, we're at risk of mistaking hype or even propaganda for the true signal. Our next stop, here, Canada. One of the other trends that I study is online gig work. So, people who are delivering food or people using a ride-hailing app like Uber or Lyft, or even people who are, in their parents' basement selling their computer coding services to someone somewhere else in the world. Now, official data tell us that this kind of work is not significant. So that's what the official economic data show. Really? How many of you took an Uber or a Lyft to get here today? Okay, so, oh my God, that's almost everybody. Well, I did too. And how many of you had a driver that was at the beginning of their career, or somebody new to Canada, driving that Uber or Lyft? So the people that are most likely to take on this kind of work are, in fact, the people least likely to be included in traditional measures of job and work, or traditional economic measures. Now think about for a moment an undocumented worker in the US. If someone knocks on your door from the government or calls from a business research firm and asks you about your economic circumstances and what you're doing for a living, and your name is attached to that information, you're not going to answer. So these are groups of people that are least likely to answer these kinds of questions. And so we have, of course we're missing them of course we're missing this from our official data. We actually went out and spoke to a broader range of Canadians using our technology, including many people at the beginning of their career. And so this could be somebody, in between Uber rides, and we reach them on their smartphone. And what they told us is that 1 in 5 young Canadians is in fact relies on this kind of work for half or more of their income. This is not marginal. And we found the same thing around the world. We've spoken to over 50,000 people in over 40 countries. It's the same in big cities, small towns, from India to Nigeria. The same story. It's not marginal. And what would happen if we see an increase in this kind of work because people can't find better alternatives? But we haven't asked people if that's happening, so we'd have absolutely no idea, and we'd be ill-prepared to, advise our kids about what the future looks like. We wouldn't put in place the right social supports, and we would miss the warning signals that could tell us that an economic downturn is coming. This is really, this is critical. It's about the future of work. Finally, let's consider some of the world's most vulnerable populations. My mother was born a refugee. My grandparents, her parents, were in transit, unable to go back to the country their home country, because it was in the midst of war. And in fact, my mother was born in a field while they were stateless. It's easy, actually, to get data on refugees and migrants when they're in one place, like in this picture. It's easy to understand what they need and who they are. But like my family, the vast majority of migrants and refugees are not all in one place. So think about Syrian refugees, Syrians who are trying to settle into a new life in Turkey, or Venezuelans leaving their country amidst the horrible crisis there. About 1/5 have left and are trying to make new lives or transiting through Colombia, Ecuador, Peru. We don't have data. Aid agencies don't know who these people are and what they need. That is, until now. We worked with a UN agency to reach out using our technology to refugees and migrants who don't have very much at all except a phone. And we heard from 13,000 refugees and migrants in all parts of the world. And without hearing from them, we wouldn't know that there are actually children under age 18 traveling on their own without their parents. We wouldn't know that many migrants don't just have an interest in basic needs like food, water, and shelter, but one of their top priority needs is actually access to education. So imagine the scarce aid dollars that we might misallocate, that we might not allocate to the true needs of refugees and migrants if we didn't check our assumptions about what they needed against their actual experiences, if we didn't actually have data from them on what they actually need. Now, the missing voices and perspectives aren't always who you think they are, who you think they might be. And in fact, they might not even be who you think of when you think of marginalized voices. For example, how much better could we predict the rise of terrorism, the places where we might see the most radicalization, if we heard from a vastly wider set of young men around the world? How much better could we predict new outbreaks of disease if we heard from those mothers if we heard it from those mothers in West Africa, where the Ebola virus keeps having outbreaks. We keep having outbreaks of the Ebola virus. How much better could we stop those outbreaks if we heard from those mothers who feared bringing their children to health clinics, and have in the past, whose missing voices have helped that disease spread unchecked? How much better could we understand whether new digital currencies are going to be adopted around the world if we heard from those people without bank accounts? We can't just hear from those of us in North America with bank accounts. We've got to hear from the rest of the people in the rest of the world who don't have bank accounts. And I didn't just make up these examples. These are actually examples of groups we're actually collecting data on right now. So we can hear from a vastly wider set of perspectives than we're hearing from now. And in fact, it's going to be, one of the things that I find really challenging in my role is that when you do hear from these wider group of voices, it actually forces you to confront, to hear some things that are really hard to hear, to confront uncomfortable truths, and to challenge our assumptions about, challenge things that we believe to be true. But that is why we need to hear these perspectives. And so I would, as we all go about our days and have to make decisions, we need to ask ourselves, who are we not hearing from? And how can we widen the net so we can hear from the broadest possible set of perspectives? So we don't know who we're going to be missing when it comes to the next US election. We can't assume we know in advance. It's this group that we're going to miss. We just don't know who we're going to miss. And we don't know who we're going to miss when it comes to predicting the next, recession or economic downturn. But what we do know is we have to hear from a vastly wider set of perspectives. Because if we don't, we are going to miss the truth.